Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the 5th webinar in EnSafe's Client Education Series. My name is Rich Heinzenberger. I am a project manager here at EnSafe. And today's topic is cradle to grave analysis, measuring and offsetting your company's carbon footprint. And it is being presented by Stephen Abille. Stephen is a project manager and a certified permitting professional out of the EnSafe Long Beach, California office. Once again, thank you. Welcome everybody. And I will turn it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Rich. Hey, good morning, everyone. And thanks for attending this client webinar series. Let me share my screen here. So getting started, cradle to grave analysis. So over kind of the next 50 minutes or so here, we'll kind of just go over how your company could really assess your carbon impacts, really the steps you'll want to go through from obtaining information to what sort of methodologies you should use to calculate your emissions. And of course, if you're able to leverage any publicly available tools, we'll go over kind of what the industry has available for you to utilize. So I guess at a high level, I mean, what is your carbon footprint? You've probably been hearing a lot about climate change and how you should reduce your carbon footprint, but what is this exactly? One resource we use a lot of is carbon, mostly from the burning of fossil fuels. And just like your actual footprint, your carbon footprint is a mark you leave on the environment. When we do this, it actually releases greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. So this footprint is a measurement of your carbon dioxide. There's also other greenhouse gases, as you see kind of in that image to the right. But for simplicity, in terms of measuring your overall impact, we talk about CO2 equivalents. So overall, the more fuel you burn, the bigger the footprint. You may think that driving your car, the amount of carbon that's being released is only from the tailpipe, but there's actually other sources we need to think about. So as an example, sticking with that kind of car metaphor, we'll kind of look at a full cradle to grave analysis for this simple scenario. So carbon is emitted from the tailpipe of the vehicle, but we also have to think about the emissions that are associated when you fuel the vehicle, the emissions that are associated from extracting that oil from the grounds, the pollution from transportation and refinement of that oil, and then finally, delivery of that fuel to the gas station. So it's a whole life cycle analysis. And that doesn't even include kind of the emissions associated with manufacturing the vehicle in the first place. So overall, the more energy you use, the bigger your footprint. So I guess a good metaphor for today's webinar is having your camera off actually decreases your footprint. So good job from everyone on this webinar here. Another simple example is if we think about an apple. An apple could travel hundreds or even thousands of polluting miles to end up in your local supermarket. So there's a lot of instances where we have to factor in of a company's overall processes, not only direct impacts, but also indirect impacts coming kind of from upstream processes to downstream processes associated with your vendor's usage of your products. So as a quick survey question, as we kind of get into the meat of this presentation, I just wanted to gauge, has your company ever calculated your carbon footprint in the past? Okay, so looking at the results, there is probably a third of you who have some sort of familiarity, who have actually calculated your emissions, and that's great. We'll kind of dive in and make sure we're kind of sharpening the pencil in terms of your methodology to calculate the various emissions in the buckets. For those that say no or I don't know, hopefully after this presentation, you'll feel armed with the tools and resources to feel comfortable to kind of initiating that process. 5 steps for reducing your carbon footprint. EnSafe has usually taken these 5 steps, when we work with our customers and clients to get them going to not only calculate their emissions, but to really set goals and targets to lessen their impact and hopefully transition to a overall zero emissions goal. So what are the 5 typical steps? Well, the first one is you first need to establish a baseline. This is critical. We need to understand what are the emissions that are happening at your facility today, where are the environmental hotspots, and basically once you're able to understand that, we could get into the reduction scenarios. So in establishing a baseline, we could implement some of the steps and methodologies that we'll talk about today. We could use some of the initial screening tools, which we'll also go over. But overall, you just need a back of the envelope calculation to really get a good gauge of where there's opportunities to improve your emissions and to set those reduction targets. So after you establish that baseline, the second step is to look at your reduction scenarios. How can you improve your company's footprint? What strategies are feasible? So overall, these reduction scenarios should look at not only low-hanging fruit, but also areas with the biggest potential for reductions. And as you see kind of in this bar graph, to the bottom left of the screen, we usually think about reductions in 3 separate buckets: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which could kind of be framed into direct impacts and indirect impacts, whether it's from electricity usage or upstream and downstream vendors. Once you're able to kind of frame out different feasible scenarios for reductions, we need to set those reduction targets. And this is critical. If you are establishing your carbon footprint for purposes of sustainability, marketing, really just environmental stewardship, we really want to create actionable and achievable reduction targets, whether that's to align with corporate regulations, with regulatory guidance. We really need to have a conclusive understanding of what is driving your company's abilities to hit reduction goals. And the 4th step here is execute and monitor. Once you're actually calculating emissions, we need a standard process to kind of review the information and calculate emissions in a standard process. If you have multiple offices, multiple companies in various cities, we want a standard process for folks to report information. And we'll go over that in some future slides. Item 5, we won't talk about today, but that is a key component as you kind of transition to zero emissions or zero impact. So this is a quick kind of timeline of GHG reporting. We won't go too deep into it, but the overall message of this is greenhouse gas reporting standards were adopted in the late 1990s by the World Resources Institute, or WRI. As part of that, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was developed to measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions, not only from private entities, but also from the public sector operations. Sort of as a result of all those initiatives, the corporate standards were published in 2001. So these were focused on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, which are basically your upstream and downstream indirect sources, those were adopted in 2009. So basically, companies focused on areas where they had the most control, so scope 1, scope 2. Once they had a good handle on that, in 2009, scope 3 came about, where companies were looking at how can I lessen the impact of the overall kind of logistics cycle of your company's operations. So this is a good image of what I've been referencing in terms of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. The figure provides an overall relationship between the various scopes and activities that direct and generate direct and indirect emissions within your company's value chain. Like I mentioned previously, scope 1 emissions are from your company's direct incineration of fuel. So really company vehicles traveling, any sort of combustion from equipment on site, that's going to be your scope 1 direct emissions. Scope 2, that's basically any energy you procure. So if you have electricity on site that you're purchasing from your local utility, if there's any steam that you're purchasing, that's really scope 2 emissions. Now, scope 3, this is a beast of a bucket, but this is a company's opportunity to really have an impact on their overall emissions. Because as you see here, there's 15 buckets within scope 3 emissions. And this allows a company to really look at their value chain, look at what are the dominant sources that are affecting your emissions, whether it's business travel, kind of your purchased goods, whether it's the materials necessary to make a product at your company, or the capital goods. So if you have vendor services, transportation services, those are all rolled up into your scope 3 emissions. So kind of diving into this is more just a table going over what I just discussed. So in summary, scope 1, really your combustion sources. Scope 2, electricity you purchase. Scope 3, all your indirect emissions upstream and downstream. With that said, our second question of the morning or afternoon, depending where you're at, which scope would generally have the greatest impact to a facility's carbon footprint? Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And I will caveat, this is almost a trick question. The word generally is key in this. I know based off your operations, this could vary, but so it's pretty split, but as folks are kind of inclined to state, scope 3, and that's generally correct. Oftentimes, if you're a unique industry like a power distributor, scope 3 emissions would not be your biggest bucket. So if you're really if you're making electricity and distributing that to the grid, we'd really see your scope 1 emissions being the majority of your contributions to your carbon footprint. But in general, a facility would usually see their scope 3 buckets as their biggest source. So before we dive into the tactics and methodologies to calculate your various emissions in these various buckets, I just wanted to go over some accounting and reporting principles. As with financial accounting and reporting, generally accepted greenhouse gas accounting and reporting principles are intended to underpin and guide greenhouse gas accounting and reporting to ensure information that you present to both your company and to the public are faithful, true, and fair. So there are a number of things we have to think about. Relevance. Ensure your greenhouse gas inventory appropriately reflects the GHG emissions of the company and serves the decision-making needs of users, both internal and external. So all stakeholders need to be kind of informed about what you are reporting. We need to think about completeness. Account for and report all GHG emission sources and activities within the inventory boundaries. So really looking at your entire logistics chain and calculating not only your direct impacts, but your indirect impacts. We need to take a look at consistency. So like I mentioned previously, if you have multiple offices, multiple companies that are under your umbrella corporation, we need to use a consistent methodology to allow for meaningful performance tracking of emissions over time. There needs to be transparency and address all relevant issues in a factual and coherent manner. This really means documenting your assumptions, really documenting what you know, what you don't know, and really accounting for any kind of methodologies that you are using to calculate your emissions. And the final thing we need to think about is accuracy. So ensuring the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions is systemically neither over nor under actual emissions. And I guess hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll feel confident to at least have tools or methodologies you can leverage to kind of create accurate emissions, but also hit each of these accounting and reporting principles. So let's dive into this. Scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions. What are the overall steps? So I know previously we mentioned those 5 steps, but if we're talking specifically in calculating our emissions, we have further steps that we need to think about. So the first is identify your sources, whether they're stationary combustion sources, mobile combustion sources, or even process emissions. These are all things we need to identify and realize that these are sources that contribute to CO2 emissions or CO2e emissions. We need to select a calculation approach. So there's multiple ways. There's direct measurements using SEMS devices. So usually you'll see these in refineries, but all facilities aren't implementing SEMS. So more often emissions can be calculated using mass balance or stoichiometric bases specific to a facility. But the most common approach is the use of emission factors. There's a lot of data out there. EPA has a guidance document called AP42, which has source-specific emission rates. And these rates can be used for calculations of your greenhouse gases where necessary. Overall, you need to collect your data. So really getting your purchase quantities of commercial fuels, obtaining your appropriate emission factors, whether they're from your SEMS devices, your AP42 documentation, or other online reporting tools. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has various tools that you could utilize, whether they're industry specific or process specific. So we'll review some of those today as well. You need to apply these tools. So really, once you have a process set up, crunch the numbers. And once you do, you need to roll up all those numbers into an overall bottom line number. It is important to plan this process carefully to minimize the reporting burden, especially if there are numerous people who are reporting. You need to reduce the risk of errors that might occur while compiling data and ensuring that all facilities are collecting information on an improved and consistent basis. So scope 1 emissions. This is really the first step. So what are direct emissions on site at your facility? Whether they're the generation of electricity, heat, or steam, or combustion of generators, boilers, or even physical or chemical processing. So if you're processing chemicals or materials like cement or aluminum, what's the associated chemicals that are coming off of that contribute to greenhouse gases? We also want to think about transportation of materials that your company specifically is doing. So if you have employees transporting materials, we want to take into account the fuels used in those vehicles and the combustion from those vehicles as well. And also fugitive emissions. These emissions result from intentional or unintentional releases, either from leaks, joints, seals, gaskets. This could be a potential source of releases such as methane, which is a contributor to your overall carbon footprint. So like I mentioned in a few slides ago, there are some calculation tools. Specifically, if you see on the top left, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol offers a number of tools that businesses and industries can use to help with their Scope 1 emission calculations. So this first spreadsheet that you see, emission factors from cross-sector tools. This is a good source where it's a spreadsheet where you basically enter the data required in this kind of green box. So for stationary combustion sources, you basically enter the fuel type, whether it's diesel, natural gas, and it'll basically spit out your greenhouse gas emissions. This is critically important for, I guess, those 60-some% of you that either have not calculated your carbon footprint or have no idea what it is. Use this tool, really get an understanding of your baseline emissions from your Scope 1 combustion sources. In terms of your Scope 1 mobile sources, we really need to think about vehicle miles traveled and overall fuel consumption from transportation or employee trips. You could use this tool as well that I mentioned in the previous screen. They have all these various data requirements. But if you're savvy with emissions modeling, you could override model defaults in terms of the emission factors. So grams per mile, how many grams of carbon emitted per mile traveled, using emission modeling tools such as EnSafe 2021, which is a California specific model, or on a nationwide model, you could use something like MOVES. each of those two models are really getting granular into the emission factors. But if you want defaults, use this kind of greenhouse gas protocol spreadsheet to calculate your mobile source combustion emissions. So as I mentioned, fugitive emissions, there's some general guidance on how to do that. Really, this is applicable if you have refrigerants, if you have any sort of cold storage or industrial refrigeration, you'll want to look at your fugitive emissions. If you are a refinery, surely you're going to have fugitive emissions associated with your piping and any kind of process where there's any leaks from potential flanges. Let's talk about scope 2 emissions. So this is a sector where we could start thinking about calculation of emissions in two different manners. So scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the purchase of electricity. And purchase of electricity is defined as electricity that is purchased or otherwise brought into the organizational boundary of the company. For many companies, purchased electricity represents an opportunity to reduce your emissions. This is because you could implement kind of clean energy, whether they're photovoltaic cells or any sources to really get off of grid energy. Companies can install efficient on-site cogeneration plants where it's feasible, both on a cost and permitting basis, and it often replaces some of the purchase or more GHG intensive electricity from the grid or electricity supplier. But overall, if you're purchasing your electricity or you're generating your own electricity, there's two accounting methods for scope 2 emissions. There's either the market-based or the location-based. And really, you could select your methodology based off of kind of the information you are receiving either from your utility, or if you don't have any information, we would recommend the location-based. So market-based is recommended if you need to be really specific on scope 2 emissions. If scope 2 emissions are a driving factor to your overall carbon footprint, so it's a major source, you should probably look at market-based methodologies. Of course, if really your scope 2 emissions aren't a large source, we don't want you spending all your effort and time for something that isn't a major driver. Really, I know everyone has day jobs and calculating a carbon footprint isn't your day-to-day operations. So we want to be efficient with your time and really using the most effort to track information, calculate emissions, and report on an annual basis things that make sense of what's driving your overall footprint. So overall, the market-based method reflects the GHG emissions associated with choices a consumer makes regarding its electric supplier or product. These choices, such as choosing a retail electricity supplier or a specific generator, is important when kind of pulling your market-based emission factors. So under the market-based method of scope 2 accounting, an energy consumer uses the GHG emission factor associated with qualifying contractual instruments it owns. So that's a lot there. So if we unpack that statement, if you are contracted specifically with a utility, you have some terms of and agreements in terms of where are the various resources that are contributing to the electricity you purchase. Based off that specific electricity mix, there is an energy intensity factor. So that is specific to what is coming to your facility. And if that's known, you should use that, and that's considered market-based emission rates. If all this is kind of over your head and really you just need something, you get kind of electricity utility bills every month and you want to calculate your scope 2 emissions from that, I would recommend using the location-based. And there is a lot of information regarding location-based emission rates that you could use. One of them being eGrid. So eGrid stands for the Emissions and Generation Resources Integrated Database. This is a good source which is basically a comprehensive database of the environmental characteristics of almost all electric power generated in the United States. So you basically look at your specific region where you're in, I know eGrid breaks it up in a handful of regions, and they basically assume a default electricity mix, and they'll give you a rate, a rate that you could use and multiply to your overall kilowatt hours of annual usage. So whether you're using a market-based or basically your location-based a method, it's basically diving into the appropriate emission factor given the constraints or availability of information to your facility and company. All right, so scope 3 emissions. Like I mentioned before and how everyone kind of assumes, scope 3 emissions is usually the largest source. There are a number of benefits associated with measuring scope 3 emissions. For many companies, the majority of their GHG emissions and cost reduction opportunities lie outside of their operations. By measuring your individual company's scope 3 emissions and the impacts of indirect sources, you can assess where the emission hotspots are in your supply chain, identify resources and energy risks in the supply chain, identify which suppliers are leaders and which ones are laggards in terms of their sustainability performance, and engage suppliers to assist them to implement sustainability initiatives. So overall, scope 3 emissions, like we mentioned previously, can come from transportation of goods, transportation of purchased fuels. And when I say transportation, these are really hired transportation, not being performed by your own individuals. Because as you know, that would be scope 1. So if you have a vendor transporting your fuel, transporting your product, that's scope 3 emissions. So overall, since companies have discretion over which categories are applicable, scope 3 shouldn't be used to kind of compare against companies to companies. You really need to look at the whole scale, scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 3 emissions may vary between various companies, but we really need to look at the entire pie. So scope 3 emissions, there's 15 buckets we really need to look at. There are 8 upstream categories, as you see on the left here, and 7 downstream categories. The upstream categories are generally based on purchased goods and services. Downstream are generally associated with activities that are sold, or activities or goods that are sold. So keep that in mind. As you're kind of looking at scope 3 emissions, all these may not be applicable to your facility's operations, but you kind of want to look at each of these buckets and assess whether it makes sense for you guys to calculate those emissions and report them. So as you're kind of probably feeling, scope 3 emissions are complex. They're difficult to measure because there exist various categories and include many upstream and downstream stakeholders. Using this decision tree thought process allows you to kind of step through how you should calculate your emissions. Companies may use methods listed here for the various services that are applicable. So the first 2 methods, you see supplier-specific method and hybrid method. Supplier-specific requires the reporting company to collect data from the suppliers. Same thing with hybrid, so you're selecting data from the suppliers. Well, the bottom 2, average data and spend-based, uses secondary data, i.e. industry standard data. So if I dive into that deeper, supplier-specific collects product-level cradle-to-grave GHG inventory data from goods or service providers. So supplier-specific will usually be your most accurate. If your kind of suppliers are calculating their sustainability initiatives, their carbon metrics, ask for those. They'll be able to provide that to you, and really you'll get an accurate scope 3 allocation if your suppliers are able to provide that to you. If no, for some of the buckets, you're likely to use a hybrid method, which uses a combination of supplier specific, where available, and secondary data to fill in the gaps. So this would involve allocating scope 1 and scope 2 emissions data directly from the suppliers, while also calculating upstream emissions of goods and services from suppliers and their associated activity on the amount of fuel and activity and waste that they use. So it's really a mash of see what information you have, where you have gaps, really implement some of those tools and methodologies we discussed about before to fill in kind of default values for information that you may not have. Okay, so right here, we're gonna dive into a tool called the Scope 3 Evaluator. If your company has not calculated emissions, the Scope 3 Evaluator is a great source to really dive into your Scope 3 emissions. So it is primarily focused on the various buckets within Scope 3, but it also is able to roll up your Scope 1 and 2 emissions if you have those, and if not, it gives you some high level assumptions of those impacts. So you'll want to leverage this measurement tool if you've never calculated your emissions before, and you'll find this on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol website. So if you just Google Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you'll see kind of tools available that you could leverage. And it's not uncommon for, like I mentioned, for businesses to have Scope 3 emissions really driving their footprint. Again, these are things not in your direct control and not coming from the grid energy you are purchasing. So in leveraging the Scope 3 Evaluator tool, basically you just have an interface and a rough approximation of their Scope 3 footprint, regardless of the size or kind of organization of your company. The tool basically works by stepping you through a series of questions, so a series of tabs about your organizational structure and activities. And then ultimately, it's rolled up into a results tab, which not only breaks down your Scope 1 and Scope 2 buckets, but it looks at your Scope 3 emissions in a granular sense, where you're looking at the 15 contributors to Scope 3 emissions. I just want to caveat that this tool is not designed to help you collect data. While they do provide a checklist that you could kind of provide to your employees in various offices, this tool is not meant to be kind of collect this. You really need to look at your whole product life cycle and use kind of the available checkbox worksheets as general guidance, but really adapt that worksheet to your needs. So now I kind of just want to walk you through this tool. So what we're seeing here is kind of the general questions of your company, kind of what industry you're in, really the time period. So when you start entering data in later screens, whether you're entering data for a monthly basis, quarterly basis, this model will basically roll up all those emissions in an annual basis. So don't worry if for this initial screening, if you don't have annual data, input what you have in terms of the best available duration for the various sources, and the model will basically scale it appropriately. So we're kind of clicking through hypothetical screens of this tool. Things you'll need once you get to owned and operated facility questions, you'll need things like facility square footage. So that's square footage of the various buildings in your company, as well as the employee count. We'll need to know expenses such as purchased goods, your utility expenses, business travel, etc. And we'll also need to know kind of the expenses of your finished goods. And if you don't kind of have a lot of this information, you could feel free to leave it blank. You could close the screen. The cool thing about this tool is you have to create a login. So once you log back in, it'll be back where you left off. So if you need to kind of collaborate with your team members to get some of this information, you don't need to finish this A to Z process all in one step. So as we kind of go through the other tabs, there's a tab on logistics to state if you own or lease vehicles traveled and transport services that you would hire. Really, you can enter your business travel information here, your kind of third-party transport information. And as I mentioned before, this really rolls up into the various scope 3 buckets. So if we look at specifically these various buckets, these are the results that you would see from the scope 3 evaluator tool. Scope 1 and 2, when we're talking about what's the size of your facility, how much electricity do you purchase, that's going to be rolled up in the scope 1 and 2. And you could either enter that information in the model and spit out those emissions, or if you had those emissions already calculated, there's actually a checkbox. See how it says, I have calculated scope 1 and 2 emissions. You check that box, you can upload those numbers, and those will basically be rolled up into those bar graphs there. You could also look at your granular contributions to your scope 3 breakdown. And even more so, if you click on category 1, purchase goods and services, you could really drill into that and to see what's really driving those emissions. Because based off our experience, we usually see scope 3 emissions are the greatest source in an overall footprint. And then within scope 3, category 1, purchase goods and services are the largest contributor within scope 3. So you could kind of step down and go more granular and really look at what are the major drivers, see how you could improve the sustainability within your logistics chain, and really have open conversations with your vendors about how you could improve that. So if we're kind of just summarizing everything we talked about this morning / afternoon, really, if you haven't done this before, you just need to get started and dive right in. Start leveraging some of those tools on the Greenhouse Protocol website, whether they're sector specific or general. Start calculating your scope 1 emissions. Really start compiling your utility, electricity bills. Start entering that information in available tools, or you could start searching for emission factors, whether from AP42 or eGrid, to get process and utility specific information. And then baseline your estimates. Once you have a general idea on where your emissions are coming from, really identify those hotspots. Identify areas that are driving your footprint and see what makes sense in terms of reductions and from what sources. And overall, you could get as granular as you want in this, but as I stated previously, you'll really want to stick with areas that are driving your emissions. You want to be as accurate as possible, but you also want to be reasonable with the amount of time you spend on this, because you could get into kind of a PhD thesis on how you dive into your emissions. So recommendation, look at those kind of hotspots and drivers to your emissions as you kind of dive into additional resources and more granular data. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
The question is, who has access to the data if you enter it into the Evaluator tool, EPA, FOIA? Question mark. That's
a good question. Really, data is not stored or logged here, especially if you're worried about confidential information or regulators getting their hands on this. Really, it's stored in the cloud, I should say. So you could basically come back to the data, but this data is not being reported to agencies. So really, it's there for the user's kind of storage and for them to get back to. But completion of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol tool does not automatically get sent or uploaded to an agency on your behalf.
All right, we did have a question in the chat. Are the professional development certificates that each registered attendee gets for these webinars, are they able to be used for BCSP recertification? And the answer to that is yes. And just a reminder that everybody will receive a certificate for 1 professional development hour that will be emailed to you following this presentation.
So the one thing about EPA moves, if you don't have a lot of database experience, it will require you to not only download EPA's free model, but it also requires you to download a relational database. So something like SQL Server. So in doing so, there is some guidance that EPA provides on writing and scripting queries to really post-process your data. So when you go to that link, download the model, or read through the installation instructions to download something like SQL Server or SQL Database, and really read through the guidance documents on post-processing data. Because if you're not a developer, there's some queries that will be helpful to kind of sum up your overall emission rates if you have various sources, such as various equipment. If you want to look at your overall average emission rate from your various equipment to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions, you'll have to post-process that data. And really, those queries that the EPA has defined for the users will be super helpful. So you don't have to kind of think of how you become a coder on the fly. So
looks like we have possibly one more question here.
Yeah, so the greenhouse gas protocol aligns with a lot of industry groups, and really RBA would be bundled on kind of the greenhouse gas protocol's purview. I know with the GHG protocol, they also align with industries such as GLEC. So really, if you're sticking to the GHG protocol, it should really check the box for kind of methodologies from industry groups. So there's alignment there.
Yeah, and just to recap, that question was, how do industry reporting requirements such as RBA or Responsible Business Alliance fit the GHG format? Once again, thank you for joining us. Great job, Stephen. Join us next week for our topic, fall protection, getting anchored in the mountain of codes. Please feel free to reach out to us via email. Once again, thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. And this concludes our presentation.